So I can tend to be kind of a slob in the shop when I'm working on something. On a good day, my bench might look like this, but a lot of times it's more like this. As you can see, my current shop is not big, and when I'm filming a project, I tend to just move things out of the way of the camera to try and keep the camera shot a little cleaner, and that increases the clutter significantly. But soon I'm going to be moving into a much larger space, and during the course of the construction, there's been a lot of scraps and offcuts that have ended up in the contractor's trash pile, and I have liberated those for reuse. Now, this is all construction grade stuff, so it's not really fit for fine furniture, but it's definitely okay for making a shop cart. So my whole idea in making this shop cart is so I have a place to pile up all the tools and materials that I'm using during a project, so I can keep them out of a camera shot and also keep them from piling up on the table saw, which then makes using that a pain in the butt. So to make this shop cart, I'm repurposing a lot of the leftover siding trim pieces that were in that scrap pile. So I started this project by spending about an hour and a half planing all the pieces to be uniform thickness and cutting off the snipe and joining the edges. Once I finished that, I started cutting out the pieces that would make the 4 legs of the shop cart. I was short by just a little bit, so for the 4th leg I have 1 full piece and then I glue 3 others together to make the whole leg. Incidentally, I'm 100% making this cart up as I go along. It's not a terrifically complicated project, but if I had had a little more planning, I might have used the wood slightly more efficiently. So I just used regular Titebond 2 to glue everything together. I started by doing those 3 pieces and then the other 3 legs. Then once those first 3 had all dried, I glued up the 4th leg. The legs were just short enough that I was still able to use my benchtop joiner on them. Luckily, with the new shop, I'm finally going to have room for a full-size joiner. Once I had cut all the legs to length, I started working on making all the pieces for the sides. Once all the pieces were cut to size, I started working on the joinery. In the past, if I was going to make a cart like this, I would have always used my Festool domino cutter to be able to do all the joinery. But for this video, I thought I would do a technique that's a little more accessible to the average woodworker. Ordinarily, I'd say you can have my domino when you pry it from my cold dead hands, but I also recognize that a tool that costs $1,200 is not normally something that the average home hobbyist would want to get. So for this project, I'm going to use this $30 self-centering dowel jig. So this thing works pretty simply. You just clamp it onto the edge of the board that you're drilling the holes into, you line up the corresponding hole that you're using with your line for your hole, and then you drill. I do have a few complaints with this. One, it is kind of hard to see the line on the tool when you're trying to line it up with your board, but for $30 I can get over that pretty quickly. Anyway, for something so simple, it works really well. While this was not quite as fast as using the domino, it was still pretty quick. I drilled 96 holes in about an hour. I'm including marking out all the hole locations in that time. The only thing that would have made this go quicker is if it was a little easier to line up the jig and if my drill had had some kind of stop bushing on it. It was marginally easier to line up the jig on the wider legs because I could see in through the top. I'm trying to get it a little bit on camera here, but with the flashlight it's sort of just washing everything out. I wish that those marks were a little more apparent though on the jig. I cut up some 1/2-inch red oak dowels to be able to complete the joints. I didn't really have any issues at all getting all my joints to line up. The jig did a great job. I glued the 2 long sides together and then let those fully dry. I should have used a softer mallet or some kind of block between the mallet and the wood when I pounded these together, because the pine is pretty soft and dented easily. On the other hand, this is just a shop utility cart and I'm not concerned about keeping it looking nice. Because the holes in the corners of the legs intersected, I had to drill out some of the dowel from the first joints. Then I was able to proceed with putting the two halves together to make the cart. One thing I'll say about this dowel joinery, much like with the domino joinery, as long as your pieces of wood are cut really nice and square, getting a good square shape when you put it all together is pretty easy. There's another easy way that I could have done this that I'll mention, and I could have used pocket hole screws, but I decided not to because I didn't want to have the exposed holes, and they're never going to be quite as strong as these dowels will be. That being said, I did use some pocket holes for a few things that you're going to see later on, but never in a spot anyone's ever going to see. The wheels that I got for this cart are pretty big, so to be able to attach them using 4 screws, I needed to cut some sort of blocks to put into the corners. The glue is forming the real strength of this joint. I'm just using the brads to hold everything in place while the glue dries. These little strips are going to form up the shelf supports. They're just glued and nailed in as well. I also wanted to have a handle on this cart, so pushing it around or maybe hanging a towel off it or something would be easy, so I glued up some stock for those now. The handle itself is going to be a piece of leftover closet rod that I have, but the brackets I'm making out of some of that construction lumber. The most important thing I had to keep in mind on these was to make sure I made them mirror images of each other. Attaching the brackets to the cart is a little bit of a challenge given the shape I made the brackets, so I decided I would use a single dowel plus a screw for each one. At this point, using the dowel jig on the cart was a little tricky because I couldn't fully lower it, but I made it work. I did some basic shaping on the handle brackets using a belt sander and a spindle sander, but that was about it. At this point, I only permanently installed one of the handle brackets using glue. The other one was only temporarily installed, with half the peg glued into the cart itself and then just the screw holding the bracket on. I did it this way because I wanted to sand the entire cart with the brackets installed, and I still wasn't sure if I was going to put the handle on before or after the finishing process. I decided I wanted to add some support bracing to the centers where the shelves would be, and at this point the only real way I could get these pieces installed was to use pocket holes. The shelves themselves were made out of some of the scrap OSB that was left over from the build. This toolbox liner is some of the only stuff I specifically purchased for this build. I used some 3M 77 spray to attach it to the top of the OSB. Like I mentioned earlier, the handle itself is made out of an extra piece of closet rod that I had, and I painted it black to match the shelves. I had sanded the entire cart off camera, and I decided I'd fully install the handle before the finishing. For finishing, I used 2 coats of a semi-gloss water-based polyurethane. I did not put a lot of time or effort into the finishing, I just wanted to get a little bit of protection on the wood. The shelves themselves were glued in with a little bit of leftover construction adhesive. When it came time to put on the wheels, I found that despite my best efforts, I still didn't actually manage to fully support that 4th corner. I both glued and nailed in some extra little blocks so I'd have more room to put in screws. These casters ideally would have been bolted into some threaded inserts, but I think for my purposes those big panhead screws will be just fine. And with that, the cart was done. So this was definitely not an overly complex build, but I'm glad that I used up scraps that were otherwise going to end up in the landfill, and I was able to use some different techniques than I usually do. I'm really looking forward to having a different place to set all my crap while I'm in the middle of projects, and if you've made it this far, thanks for watching.